Welcome to everyone as you join. My name is Samantha Barrett Aqua. So I'm a counselor and a leadership coach with ADO, and I'll be moderating tonight's session. So good evening once again to all of you. So we're just waiting for some more people to be admitted from the waiting room, and then we can begin our session tonight. All right. So again, welcome. Welcome to the Africa Dyslexia Organization Online Academy. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'll introduce myself again. My name is Samantha Barrett Aqua. So I'm a counselor and a leadership coach at Africa Dyslexia Organization, and I'll be moderating tonight's session. So whether you're returning from day one or you're joining us for the very first time this evening, you're very, very welcome. Okay, so let's jump right into it. We'll start with just telling you a little bit about ADO. So Africa Dyslexia Organization is a Pan-African organization working to ensure that individuals with dyslexia and related learning differences are not excluded from education, employment, or leadership opportunities. Now, our work focuses on early identification, teacher and systems capacity building, research, advocacy, and structural reform. Now, we believe that every learner deserves an education that sees them fully, not just where they struggle, but all of who they are and all that they can become. Now, this two-day training on the science of reading and the science of writing is part of our ongoing commitment to equipping educators across Africa with knowledge grounded in the best available evidence. And we're honored to bring this training to you free of charge, and we are grateful for your commitment to your learners. Okay, I hope everyone can hear me. Can I just get a thumbs up if the chat is enabled? Can we get a thumbs up or an emoji so I can know you can hear me? Okay, great. So let me continue to tell you about tonight, which is day 2 of our training, and that's the science of writing. Now, writing is far more than putting words on a paper. It is a complex cognitive process that develops alongside reading and, when well taught, can powerfully strengthen literacy outcomes. Now, tonight, Dr. Lambert will walk us through the growing body of research on how students learn to write and how writing and reading work together to support literacy development. Now, we will explore 3 complementary research-based frameworks. The shared knowledge model, which explains how reading and writing draw on common knowledge while also requiring distinct processes. The simple view of writing, which highlights the interaction between transcription and text generation, and the interactive dynamic literacy model, which illustrates the interconnected nature of reading, writing, language, and cognition across literacy development. Now, for those who joined us yesterday on day 1, tonight builds directly on the foundation we laid around the science of reading. For those joining for the first time, you're welcome. Now, tonight's session stands fully on its own and you will gain complete value from it. Right, so let's get into some housekeeping before we begin. This session is being recorded and may be used for educational and public dissemination purposes by the Africa Dyslexia Organization. Participants are expected to maintain professional standards throughout. If cameras are on, please ensure appropriate dress, an upright posture, a suitable camera angle and background, and no eating on camera. If you're unable to maintain a professional camera presence, please keep your camera off. Now at ADO, safeguarding extends to our online spaces. So this includes respectful communication, no inappropriate visuals or gestures, no independent recording of the session, no sharing of private participant information, and professional conduct in the chat and verbally. Now, ADO reserves the right to remove participants who do not adhere to these standards. Please keep your microphones muted unless you're invited to speak. Questions may be placed in the chat throughout, and we will hold a live Q&A at the end. Sign language interpretation is available throughout this evening. So we have Martin, who is interpreting during the training session, and Josiah during the Q&A segment. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce our facilitator for the evening. So let's just give me a moment. Okay, so Dr. Susan Lambert is the Chief Academic Officer for Literacy at Amplify and the host of...
Auntie Jo, ọba kẹsẹ má trouble.
Hello. Please, can we mute our microphones? Okay, so let me start again. So Dr. Susan Lambert is the Chief Academic Officer for Literacy at Amplify and the host of Science of Reading, the podcast, an award-winning program highlighting current research and evidence-based practices in literacy education. With a distinguished career spanning classroom teaching, district leadership, and educational consulting, Dr. Lambert has contributed to the advancement of instructional practice and policy across both national and international contexts. She holds a master's degree in education with a concentration in curriculum and a doctoral degree in education specializing in reading science. Dr. Lambert has also completed advanced coursework in education policy, equipping her with a comprehensive understanding of the intersections between research, practice, and policy in literacy instruction. We are very honored to have Dr. Lambert lead tonight's session. Dr. Lambert, the floor is yours. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Samantha. I appreciate the introduction and appreciate the opportunity to be back for day 2. Yesterday was amazing, and we had some excellent questions in the Q&A at the end. So I am hoping and I believe that we will have similar success today. So I am going to get myself all set here so I can see the chat and also see my slide deck. FYI, if you have questions, please put those questions in the chat so that we can get to them at the end. And for those of you who weren't here yesterday and didn't join us, don't worry, we're going to review a little bit for some relevant information that will help us make some connections to writing. So today we are talking about the science of writing, and we're going to dig in a bit to the research that supports the development of students' skilled writing. So today's objectives, similar to yesterday, except we're talking about writing. We're going to define the science of writing and describe its interdisciplinary research base. So we're going to look at what writing actually entails. You'll be able to explain how reading and writing function as reciprocal and mutually reinforcing literacy processes, and we'll understand why that is. Again, as Samantha described, we'll talk about the shared knowledge model, the simple view of writing, and the interactive dynamic literacy model, which sounds like a lot, and what the implications are for instruction. We'll understand the cognitive and linguistic processes that contribute to skilled writing, and then apply some research-based principles to design integrated literacy instruction that strengthens both reading and writing outcomes. And again, like yesterday, that last bullet point, I want you to keep that last bullet point in mind as we go through today's presentation. Again, today you'll need a piece of paper or something to write on and a writing utensil, or if you can multitask on your computer, feel free to take some notes on your computer. I'm not able to do that. I would be better with a pencil and a paper, but you can work however works best for you. And the first thing I'm going to ask you to do with that piece of paper and writing utensil or your computer is similar to what we did yesterday, but this time I'd like you to take about a minute to write all the words or phrases that you think we will discuss related to the science of reading. So I'm going to put myself on mute and I'm going to give you about a minute to do that. All the words and phrases you think we will discuss related to the science of writing. And when you're ready, put 1 to 2 or 3 ideas in the chat so we can see what you're thinking. So we've got the 44 sounds of English. We have language and brainstorming. We have handwriting. Any other ideas? Vocabulary, the writing process, types of sight words, letter construction. Anybody else have ideas in their letter formation, phonics? Lots of good ideas here, and I think you're going to see lots of things that are going to be talked about. Phonemic awareness, segment letter sounds, letter recognition. Great. All right. Thank you for putting those ideas in the chat. I realize that that is a little bit vulnerable to put that out there. Some people don't like to be wrong about what they put in there, but all about learning is being vulnerable and putting yourself out there. Okay. Yesterday, I promised our audience we were going to talk about the modes of language, and we're going to talk about those before we jump into this idea of writing. And so to many of you, this is probably, excuse me. To many of you, this is probably common sense, right? And to some of us, it's like, oh, that's right. There are different modes of language. So when we talk about the modes of language, we think about oral language, which involves listening and speaking. We talked yesterday about the importance of oral language for reading development. And then we think about written language, and that's all about reading and writing, right? And we talked about how written language is often more complex than spoken language. And so we have to teach students to sort of deal with that. And that's true whether you're reading the printed word or whether you're going to be writing the printed word. So 4 modes of language. And these modes of language develop differently throughout our literacy lifetime. And I want to talk a little bit about that. So yesterday, I mentioned the fact that we have this receptive language, which is all the language we take in. And then we have expressive language, and that's the language that we put out, right? And these develop in 2 different ways. And so maybe you'll make a connection to this when we think about the simple view of reading. We have this thing called oral language, which is what I'm doing right now. And we have this thing called written language, which is on the slides, the things that we read and the things that we write. And the interesting thing is we know that we can leverage oral language because it tends to develop naturally We're born as natural communicators, and the very first thing we do before we're even born is we start listening. So we know in the third trimester, babies in utero already start to take in language. And they hear that language, including the rhythm of the language, the tone of the language, and they're always listening. And when they're born, they can actually hear all of the sounds in any language. So we're born being an amazing form of listening, but they will start to home in on the language that's spoken around them. So we talked a little bit about multilingual learners yesterday, but for children that grow up in a monolingual home or a home that speaks one language, they will definitely start to then hear the vocabulary and the sounds and the accents and the rhythm of that language. For children that are in biliterate environments or multiliterate environments, one or two or more languages, they will also then pick up on that second or third language that's spoken around them. So that becomes sort of their home language, right? Or home languages. So listening is the very first thing that children do. And then we know over time, they start to try to speak that language. So this starts with maybe them mimicking sounds that they hear or rhythms and patterns that they hear. And as they continue to grow and develop, they get better and better at saying words, and then they start to form simple sentences and longer sentences. And so you can see here that language they're taking in, that listening language, they just do that naturally. The more they're around that language, the better they're going to get at it, both the sounds and the words of that language. And then they start speaking that language. So that's what happens in oral language, and that's sort of the progression. When thinking about written language, the first thing we learn, or the easiest, and I say that in quotes because it's not really easy, is reading. Reading is sort of like listening, right? It's language that we take in with listening. We take that language in with our eyes and with our ears. When we read, we take in that information through our eyes and we make some connections with that to our language center. But we do that reading first. And the hardest thing we actually ask students to do is write that expressive language. And we're going to dig into why that is the most complicated thing. And it's not just what we ask our students to do. If you think about this for your own personal literacy journey, you know that it's much easier to listen and talk. Well, maybe sometimes it's hard to listen if you can't focus, but you know what I mean, right? Like it's easy to listen, it's easier to speak. If you're literate, you can read the language, but when you have to sit down and write something, it takes a little more cognitive energy. And so it's important we pay attention to some things in the writing process that will help us in reading. We'll probably talk about this again later in the presentation, but a question came up yesterday at the end of the day. How do we know if students really have those sound spelling patterns secure or if they're doing pretty well with their phonics? And one of the answers to that is you ask them to write what they hear. And if they can represent sounds, sound spelling patterns, if they can write words correctly and spell them correctly, it's a pretty good indication that they're secure then in that particular reading code. And it's because writing is much more difficult in all aspects than reading is. Okay, so what I'd like you to do in the chat, and this is a bit of review from yesterday. So what are the 2 cognitive capacities that are required for skilled reading? So remember we went over this yesterday. They're represented in the simple view of reading framework. So I'd like you to put in the chat the 2 cognitive capacities that are required for skilled reading. So anybody that was with us yesterday. Great. Word recognition, language comprehension. Yes, word recognition and language comprehension. Great job. And if you only remembered one of them, that's okay. Both of those capacities, the capacity for word recognition and the capacity for language comprehension, This is called the simple view of reading for those of us that weren't here yesterday. And remember that you can't just decode the words on the page and think that you're doing skilled reading. You have to understand what the words mean. And we're going to make a connection between this and what that means for writing. We also talked about the strands of literacy development. And you remember the strands of literacy development represents the simple view of reading with a little more detail. So on the top, you can see language comprehension. On the bottom, word recognition. And all of these skills and abilities sort of weave together to produce this really strong reading. Language comprehension, what's involved in that? Again, a review from yesterday. Your background knowledge. The more you know about a topic, the better you're going to be able to comprehend the text that you read. Same with vocabulary. The vocabulary that you don't know in a text passage often trips you up in comprehension. So knowing what the words mean, or the shades of meaning, or the synonyms that are used and why the author selected those. Yesterday, we talked a tiny bit about sentences or syntax. And why it's so important to comprehend at the sentence level. We're going to come back and review that when we talk about writing. We talked about reasoning and building this mental model, right? So you build a picture while you're reading of what's happening within that text. And it's important that that mental model is strong. So that's language comprehension. Word recognition is all about understanding the sounds of a language, how those sounds are represented with letters or combinations of letters, and how those letters build together to make words. We talked about how word recognition is table stakes, like it's very important as an entry point to that skilled reading or that reading comprehension. And we also talked about how word recognition is a constrained skill. And what that means is that once you learn to recognize those words or become instant, you don't have to relearn that. You can apply those sound spelling patterns to new and unfamiliar words really quickly to help you unlock the meaning of a text. So you're probably wondering, why did I spend that much time reminding you of the two frameworks from yesterday? The reason is because reading and writing are what we call reciprocal processes. So I did what any good student would do is I Googled the origin of the word reciprocal and I Googled the definition of the word reciprocal. And I like doing this with words that we think we know what the meaning is, because often it unlocks deeper concepts that we're like, oh, that's right. And that happened to me when I did this with reciprocal. So if you look on the left-hand side, you see the origin of this word is actually Latin, and it has two Latin prefixes in it, re and pro. And what's important about this re and pro is that it's this idea of back and forth and back and forth. And reciprocal means whatever happens on one side of the coin is impacted by the other side of the coin. So you get this idea, just like is in the definition here, and I like definition number 2, there's a binding of two things together. So if you strengthen a student's reading ability, you are strengthening a student's writing ability. If you strengthen a student's writing ability, you are then in turn strengthening their reading ability. And in order to create a literate individual, you have to be able to do all of those modes of communication, or those modes of language: speaking, listening, reading, and writing. Now, I understand that there are some very literate individuals that use sign language as their language to communicate, right? And so there's always, some outliers there, but when we're talking about the students and the general population, whether you're dyslexic, whether you have language-based learning disabilities, right? All of us need to learn in some way to read, write, speak, and listen. And we're going to talk about the important connections between reading and writing. So The very first model that we're going to talk about is called the shared knowledge model. You are going to get these slides and I'll share them as a PDF. And you can actually Google this reading and writing relations and their development and get access to this article because it's open source, right? It's a PDF that you can find. It was published in the year 2000. So remember, when we talk about the science of reading, we've talked about decades of research. Similarly, right, we're talking about a lot of research that continues to grow and develop. And I like to go back to this one in the year 2000 because it's got some really interesting concepts in it, written by Tim Shanahan and Jill Fitzgerald. And they help us understand in this shared knowledge model that reading and writing are sort of like two buckets. And those two buckets go down to draw from a common well of information. They're built on the same foundation, right? So you're going to have some information that you're going to pull out of that foundation to use when you're writing, and some information that you're going to pull out of that well that you're going to use when you're reading. And so it's similar information down in there in the bottom of the well, but you're going to apply it slightly differently depending on if you have a reading task or if you have a writing task. I like to look at a chart, and I know this is a lot of words on a page, but we're going to come back to this one a couple of times. But this table is included in this paper, and it's really interesting just to look at this table. It talks about the categories of knowledge that both readers and writers use. So this is sort of the well of information that you're drawing from when you're either reading or when you're writing. And so meta-knowledge or pragmatics, like knowing about the functions and purposes of reading and writing, knowing that readers and writers interact. So when I write a text and I ask somebody to read it, we're interacting, not synchronously, but asynchronously. So you will be reading something that I wrote earlier. You monitor your own meaning with word identification and production strategies, both when you're reading and when you're writing. And you're thinking about what you know. And we're going to talk about how important that background knowledge is. He even talks about that here, your prior knowledge, content knowledge. All that is really important when you're both reading and writing. So I'm not going to go through each one of these, but you can see, because we're going to talk about some of the details of them, you can see how important this common well of knowledge is, literacy knowledge, for our overall reading and for our overall writing. So I'm going to introduce you to a model called the simple view of writing. Now, the simple view of writing, really similar, you can see, to the simple view of reading. And the reason I like to use this model is because, again, it will help ground us in, oh, what are the things that students need to have to be really skilled writers? So I'd like you to stop right now and think about this and predict and write about this. What do you think the relationship is between the simple view of reading and the simple view of writing? And you can write this on your own piece of paper, on your computer. If you'd like to put it in the chat, that's great too. But I'm going to give you just a minute or so to do that, to think about the relationship between the simple view of reading and the simple view of writing, and think about what that relationship might be. Anybody who is brave and wants to put some ideas in the chat, we would love to hear what you're thinking about the relationship between these simple view of reading and this simple view of writing that we have here on our screen. And if not, that's okay too. So let's dig into this and hopefully, okay, here we go. So the simple view of writing involves composition skills. And what do we mean by composition skills? Well, that's the knowledge you have about the topic that you're going to write about. And when you write, you pick certain words to use in your writing, words that communicate the idea that you intend to communicate. You have to think about syntax or sentence structure, right? So how am I going to use those words and sentences to communicate just the right idea that I want to communicate? And you have to think about the structure, which is typically the easiest part, right? Am I going to write an email? Am I going to write a summary paragraph? Am I going to write a narrative text? Is this a persuasive or an opinion piece, right? So you have to think about all of those things before you start composing your text and even while you're composing your text. But there's another often overlooked important element of writing, which we call transcription skills. And what are these skills? These are the skills of handwriting and letter formation and spelling. We're going to talk about why these are so important and why they can really get in the way of students' overall composition process. Both of those things are required for skilled writing. And what do we mean by skilled writing? Skilled writing is legible. Somebody could read what you were writing, and it has clarity, meaning that it's clear to the reader what you are trying to communicate. And you can see how those legibility, clarity are two slightly different things, right? A lot of times our students struggle with handwriting and it's messy handwriting and we can't understand what they're trying to write. Or if they have really great handwriting and spelling, sometimes they struggle to be clear in their writing. I struggle sometimes to be clear in my writing. So two things we're going to unpack. So you can see here, there's almost a one-to-one relationship. And again, we're going to unpack it. We're going to say language comprehension. Remember, we talked about that being knowledge and vocabulary and sentence structure. And you can see how composition skills are also very similar to that. You have to have knowledge about the topic. You have to have vocabulary to use. You have to understand how to structure sentences. And then word recognition, that's that constrained skill. Same with transcription skills. You have to understand how to form letters and you have to understand how to spell words. And so you can see how these are reciprocal, right? Word recognition and transcription skills are two sides of the same coin. Language comprehension and composition skills are two sides of the same coin. And together they make overall literacy. There is, and we're coming back to this interactive dynamic model at the end, near the end of the presentation, but right now I want to talk to you about the relationship that researchers found between both reading and writing. And it says here, overall, we found a strong relationship with a magnitude of R equals 0.72. You're probably wondering, what in the world does that mean? What is 0.72? That means if we have a perfect correlation, so remember the relationship between two things, if they're perfectly related, when you do one thing, it will impact the other thing. So if reading and writing had this perfect relationship, it would be a 1.0. Well, we know it's not exactly a perfect relationship. It's only a 0.72, but 72% out of 100% is pretty good. And what their research found and confirmed is that reading and writing are not independent skills. They're related to each other and they bootstrap each other. And what that means is, again, when you teach things in reading and you help apply them in writing, students are going to become even more successful in both of those things. We're going to come back to each one of these, but I want you to understand the instructional implications of this. From the early grades, students should not have separate reading and separate writing, or they should not be just instructed in reading without including elements of writing, because what we're going to see is even at the most basic level, an introduction of some form of writing is going to help them develop in their reading. So we're going to go back to the strands of early literacy development. You notice it says early literacy development and not just reading development. And we're going to talk about now how writing is related to these strands of reading development. And I know, wow, if you were here yesterday, you're like, wow, this is crazy. This is a lot of information. Luckily, this is being recorded and you will have the slides. So if you want to go back and review this and think more about it, you'll have the opportunity to do that. So let's start with language comprehension or composition. Composition is the process of getting your thoughts out of your head and down on a piece of paper. And remember, I said it's very similar to language comprehension, where we have to have knowledge of a topic. You have to have appropriate vocabulary, and we'll talk about what that looks like. That you have to put sentences down on paper in sentences in a way that makes sense. You have to reason through the text that you're actually creating, and you have to have a mental model of what you're writing about so that you can communicate that mental model to the readers of your text. So composition skills are the language skills required to think about and organize ideas that you as a writer want to convey. Remember, these are all language skills. Knowledge and vocabulary. So writing draws on the knowledge of a topic and the words to describe it. Just like in reading, the more you know about a topic, the deeper you're able to comprehend it. The more you know about the topic, the more effective you're going to be in communicating that topic in writing. And what we find is that vocabulary serves as what we call a proxy for knowledge. What does that mean? If I know a lot of things about the computer, I will have vocabulary words that are associated with the computer, right? Or if I know a lot about education, I will have a lot of vocabulary about the topic or the concept of education. If I know a lot about physical science, I will be able to do that, or physics or astronomy, right? So when you know a topic deeply, you can use the words of that topic and you can use those words flexibly. Writers have to do that in order to communicate their thoughts. The other thing is all about organization. And typically we think of organizing a text like, what kind of, am I going to write an opinion piece? Or am I going to write a 5-paragraph essay? Am I going to write a summary paragraph? But organization is always about sentence level construction or syntax. And we're going to dig into that a little bit more. So composition, we've said this, composition skills. You can't write about things you don't know about. And you can tell when somebody tries to write about something that they don't know about. As a reader, you can tell. And remember that written language is more complex than spoken language. We always, always, always want students to draw on oral language. They're working through their thinking processes, but when they put it down on paper, it's more complex. We talked about knowledge and vocabulary, so important. And we're going to go back to our categories of knowledge that readers and writers use. Notice it's in the list. Domain knowledge about substance and content. This is your prior knowledge or your content knowledge that you have and what you learned during the process. You also have to know about universal text attributes. What do I mean by that? Graphophonics, letter and word identification. We're going to dig into that in a minute. And you have to know about syntax. So that one we've already mentioned, and we're going to dig into it. Syntax and sentences are not exactly the same. This is kind of a big topic, but it's really important. And, when we're talking about the literacy research evolving, developing, we're getting more and more evidence. We're getting more and more evidence in the reading and writing research of the importance of sentence level construction. So teaching kids how to write sentences, and then also sentence level comprehension. So what is the difference between syntax and sentences? And syntax is a really important linguistic concept because syntax is all about the arrangement of words into well-formed sentences. So you can think about syntax a little bit like grammar, if you will. And every language has their unique syntactical structures. So we were talking about Spanish yesterday because that's one of the big second languages here in the United States. In Spanish, the order of grammar or their syntactical order is different than what it is in English. So in English, I talk about my white polka dotted sweater. If I said that in Spanish, I'd have to talk about my sweater white, right? So I would reverse those things. And every language has their own syntactical rules. Here's the interesting thing. Remember, we were talking about how children's language develop? Because children hear and take in all of that language information from before birth and when they're young, when they start forming sentences, it's almost natural for them to get in oral language the syntactical structure of their home language right. So my children grew up in an English-speaking environment. They started speaking sentences and they knew to say white sweater, right? Because they heard that order or the syntactical language over and over and over again. When then I started learning Spanish, I had to learn a new syntactical order and it wasn't natural or automatic. So it took me more time to learn that. So yesterday we talked about how language is naturally developing, but there are times when you have to explicitly teach things about language so all students understand. Okay, that was kind of a long left-hand turn there, but you understand syntax is the arrangement of words and phrases to form sentences, and we know sentences are a set of words that's complete in and of itself. We teach kids subjects and predicates and all the punctuation and all that. But they're really unique. They're a little bit different, but they're related. So I like this sort of understanding of sentences, best word, best order. Plumley is actually a poet, and he was thinking about some of when he was first a poet and what his poems were like. And I'd love to read this out loud because it's such beautiful language to help us understand where that sentence fits in an overall text. So it says, so my first poems were prose poems, moments of specific experience realized in sentences, best word, best order. After the sentence, then comes the paragraph, which is really a form of the sentence writ larger, fuller, deeper, filled with balance. The balance is the beautiful part. And after the paragraph or the stanza comes the whole piece, whatever. So right here, you can see the idea of best words, best order. That's that syntactical awareness. But the importance of putting sentences together in such a way that this sentence makes sense, and it also makes sense amongst the larger paragraph, and the paragraphs make sense in the overall text. We call that cohesion. And authors probably don't explicitly think about cohesion, but really well-written pieces, whether they're 2 or 3 sentences or many, many, many sentences, have this idea of text cohesion or a really good flow. So a few more things about sentences, and I know I'm spending a lot of time on sentences, but sentence level, again, comprehension and composition are critical for readers and writers. So sentences sometimes appear simple, but they hold so much importance in facilitating effective communication, allowing you as a writer to convey really intricate thoughts, emotions, or information with clarity and precision. You hear that clarity, right? And again, I know you've experienced times when somebody has written something, whether short or long, and you're like, I don't understand what that means. And perhaps the author wasn't able to write with clarity. But for a writer, sentences are the fundamental building blocks of communication, and they really form the backbone of both written and spoken language, and they're really important to understand their significance. Now, when we speak, often we don't speak in complete sentences. We just use phrases, and so it's much easier to speak than it is to write, but sentences are so critical. And we're going to talk about them as building blocks. So let's look at what those building blocks of writing are. When we're thinking about instruction, and this is important both for reading and for writing, but we're going to start on the writing side, is focusing on the sentence. Now, think about yourself for a minute. Let's say that you have to respond to somebody in an email. So you're sitting down to get ready to write an email. And you know what you need to say. You know that the structure of this is going to be an email, but you sit and you think, how am I going to start this email? And how am I going to put sentences together to communicate just the right idea? So here's where writers, even us, as I wouldn't consider myself a writer, but when I sit down to write, you don't sweat or worry about the overall idea you're trying to communicate. What makes you nervous and what makes you sweat is putting those sentences together so that you're conveying just the right idea. Often we can leverage oral language to do this. So maybe I walk away and I, find a friend and say, I've got to write this really tough email and I'm thinking about saying this. Or maybe it's just as simple as I have a dog that I like to take for a walk and he can't talk back to me, but I can often play things out for him just hearing myself say it. So leveraging oral language for students is really helps them in terms of their thinking process. So what are these building blocks specifically? So you want to think about sentence types. You want to think about expanding sentences, help students put two sentences together. And all of these ideas are well backed with research. And we know when we help students do them, it helps them become better readers and it helps them become better writers. And we know that we need to help them with organization. Again, anything that helps kids plan or generate or organize their ideas. I noticed somebody put in at the beginning in the chat this idea of the writing process, right? This is all about the writing process, thinking about what you want to write about, planning that idea out, and then taking those ideas and to putting them into complete sentences. Any graphic organizers that help students think about and plan their ideas are very beneficial for them. So back to the strands of early reading development, this idea of becoming increasingly strategic in your approach to writing, right? Again, if we go back to, let's go back to knowledge and vocabulary. So let's say you ask your students to write a paper about something in third grade. Let's say we're writing about astronomy. And then they continue to learn more about astronomy in fourth grade and fifth grade and sixth grade. And the end of sixth grade, you ask them to write about astronomy again. They're going to have developed more knowledge and more vocabulary. Hopefully they've developed more, a better understanding of how to write complex sentences. And so they'll have more abilities to be more strategic in their approach to writing. So just like we become more strategic in our approach to reading and deepen our comprehension, we can do the same with writing. For those of you that weren't here yesterday, we talked about these language comprehension skills, or these language skills at the top of the rope, as being unconstrained skills, meaning the sky is the limit. And it's the same with writing. You can continue to grow and learn more vocabulary, have thought through what you want to write about. Really, the sky is the limit in terms of strategic language development in order to write. So strategic readers construct meaning by interacting with text. This is the reciprocal effect, right? This requires fluent reading to allow the reader to focus on the meaning of words, sentences, and text. We talked about that yesterday. Well, strategic writers communicate meaning by constructing text. See, it's the opposite, or the reciprocal effect. And this requires fluent writing to allow the writer to focus on the construction of sentences and paragraphs. And we're going to unpack this idea of fluent writing in just a minute. So remember, when we talk about writing, writing is a visible record of language processing. You can tell a lot about what students know if you ask them to write about it. And it will indicate what aspects of maybe speech are eluding the student, or where the student is in the progression of reading development and where you should focus on instruction. What does that mean? That means if you are in a science class and your students are reading a chapter in the science text, and you ask them to summarize their learning about a particular topic, if you notice in their writing that they're not using the appropriate vocabulary words, or they communicated a wrong thought or idea in writing, you can take that piece of writing and go back to the student to know, oh, they have a misconception or misunderstanding, and I need to help them with that. Or they use this vocabulary word in totally the wrong way. I need to go back to the student and help them understand the real meaning of that word. So when you ask students to write, you get an insider information into what's happening inside their mind. And it's a great assessment of what students know, especially when you do this in small chunks throughout your lessons. So some high impact composition strategies. These are instructional strategies, evidence-based, have a high impact on student learning. Help students build knowledge and vocabulary, and then have them talk about it before they actually write about it. So if you ask students to write about the solar system and they don't know anything about the solar system, you're not setting them up for success. So teach them the knowledge you want them to know with the vocabulary you want them to use, have them talk about that learning, and then have them write about it. You want to explicitly teach syntax, right? The organization of those words in a sentence, and the different kind of text types. When would you write a narrative piece? When would you write an opinion piece? When would you write a persuasive piece, etc.? And we talked a little bit about syntax, or those building blocks. And we've also talked about this. Help them pre-plan their writing. Again, using discussions, graphic organizers, any kind of outlines, or any kind of checklists to really help them polish their writing. So that's all about the composition part, right? Getting your ideas down on paper. But if you don't have strong transcription skills, you're going to have problems getting your ideas down on paper. So let's think about this for a minute. Transcription skills are the foundational writing skills that are required to take the ideas from your head and put them on a piece of paper. Just like foundational reading skills, we have transcription skills that are foundational writing skills. Handwriting. So when we form letters, that draws on our orthographic coding. We're going to look at that in a minute. So this idea that I know how to represent the word mat in writing because I know at, and how to form those letters and how to spell those words, which draws on orthographic or letter knowledge and phonological coding, or this idea of phoneme awareness. Hold on with me. You're going to see this connection in a minute. Transcription skills should be practiced to automaticity. So if students can't form the letters you need them to form, you got to keep practicing so they can do this. And if they can't spell words, you got to keep them practicing at those sound spelling patterns in order to be able to generalize them to spelling words. Again, spelling reveals how well they've mastered the code. And if they can't spell, you need to go back and reteach that code to them. Why is this so important? It's so important because if you're asking students to get their ideas down on paper, if they can't form the letters or if they can't spell, they come to a stop. We talked about this yesterday. I can't spell that word. Guess what? In the process of having to spell that word or form that letter, I may have lost all the thoughts that I had that I wanted to get down on paper. And so we've interrupted their cognitive process because they're not fluent in writing and spelling. Back to the shared knowledge model, you see how important this knowledge about universal text attributes are. You have to have phonological awareness. You have to convert that to grapheme awareness to be able to form those letters. And we haven't talked about morphology, but same idea, word structure and patterns. This word recognition, sounds and letters is just as important to get to automaticity in writing as it is in reading. I want to talk about this orthographic mapping, and I promise I'm going to give time for Q&A at the end, but we talked about this just a tiny bit yesterday. And what I love about this idea of orthographic mapping, which you may have heard the term, and happy to talk more about orthographic mapping at another time, but this is the idea of how our brain, you know, that reading circuit that we're connecting in our brain we talked about yesterday, how it's connected to spelling. So when we see a printed word in reading, our brain will use the letter sound relationships plus our knowledge of phonemes to actually blend the words and then be able to recognize this word as hat. And so phonics supports learning that letter sound knowledge. But when we do writing, we're going backwards. So when we write, I want to write the word hat. I need to just deconstruct that word into its individual sounds and the letters they represent to be able to write that as a printed word. So the reciprocal relationship is right there. It's the forward reading from HAT to the letter phonemes to hat, and writing is backwards. And it works the same with any word. Once this word hat has become an instant word and I recognize it over and over and over again, I should be able to write that word then on paper. And so this orthographic mapping process is so important. This doesn't talk about meaning in here. That's important too. But this is a good illustration of the forwards process and the backwards process. So the deconstruction of words and the construction of words. Okay, let's talk about some connections to handwriting. So do you know that I haven't talked about using a computer? Sometimes we have to have kids type as if they're unable to write. But for students that are typically progressing, printing letters by hand actually activates the reading brain. So there is a lot of research that says when we teach kids how to represent as the letter M and write that and connect the instruction together with both sound and then writing, there is a larger effect on both their fluency in writing and their fluency in reading. It engages neural pathways that link this visual perception, motor control, and phonological processing. It reinforces that orthographic mapping, right? So decoding, reading the words, encoding, spelling the words, rely on the same fundamental alphabetic knowledge. Again, handwriting practice yields significantly higher letter naming accuracy. So when you're doing handwriting, you're not just doing letter formation handwriting. You're reinforcing then those sound spelling patterns for students when you actually point them out to them. And we talked about this cognitive load and automaticity. So without automatic letter formation, your attention is consumed by the mechanical aspect. Think of those kids that have dysgraphia, right? They're all consumed with trying to form those letters and spell those words. But if we can get automaticity, it frees up your cognitive resources to both apply spelling rules, but also to get your thoughts down on paper. And this is really important. And I'm sure some of you can relate to this because everybody's tripped up by words that they can't spell. So on the word recognition side, we're talking about increasingly automatic. We talked about this yesterday. If you can read a word, you can't necessarily spell it, but if you can spell a word, we know that you can read it. So teaching spelling is teaching reading, and teaching reading is teaching spelling. And just from Louisa Moat saying that she'd look at kids' spelling for years when she gave them a spelling test, and she thought that there's more information I can get from this. And there is a lot more information we can get from how students are spelling words and how they're constructing sentences. So we talked about this importance of becoming increasingly automatic, right? This is where the fluency level at both reading and writing is so important. So automaticity and reading, we talked about this yesterday. All of those words on the screen, you probably instantly recognized if you are a fluent reader in English, right? Cat, toy, share, decorate, non-existent. Think about words that trip you up when you're spelling them. One of the words that I cannot spell is the word vacuum. I always have to think about it. I always have to look it up. And you know, there's words that do that to you too. And so when you have to think about how to spell the word, it stops the flow of you actually composing the text or writing the text. Maybe these words are necessary or embarrassed. These are some common words that are misspelled. Rhythm, weird. Weird is such a weird word, right? It's not spelled like you think it would be. And so spelling then, like we've said, is a visible record of language processing as well, and may indicate the aspects of print that are tripping the student up. So when we look at their spelling, we can think about their progression of reading and go back and reteach elements of the sound spelling patterns or letter formation, and we know exactly where our instruction should focus. Okay, how about some high impact transcription strategies? I promise we're getting near the end. We want to teach sounds and letter formations in tandem. We looked at this yesterday in one of the slides. When you're teaching the sound, teach the letter and how to form the letter. When you do those things together at the same time, then kids have higher impact on both reading and transcription or spelling. So don't just teach the sound in isolation, also teach them how to form that letter M. Again, I've said it before, you have to provide adequate practice to automaticity. So just like we talked about kids with dyslexia need more practice than typically developing students, give them the practice time they need. Some students need the same thing with letter formation and handwriting. Give them the practice opportunities to get them to where they're automatic with that. And this is a shift then in spelling from memorizing the words on your spelling or spelling list to mapping them to sound spelling patterns. We want them to understand how language is put together for reading, but also translate that language or the sound spelling patterns to writing. Again, these are high impact strategies, meaning you will get a big instructional bang for your buck when you do them. A really quick, and this is really quick because I'm going to point you to a resource that you can listen to help you understand this. But this, again, in the evolution of the science of reading, is a newer model that came out in 2020. And this idea here is that reading and writing, again, remember we talked about the correlation. There's a 0.76 correlation mean there's a high relationship between reading and writing. And essentially what this model does is it breaks down how important this is. And we didn't even talk about general cognitive skills or executive functioning, but everything sort of sits on the bedrock of that. We talked about emergent literacy skills. This is sound spellings, orthographic knowledge, phonological awareness, morphological awareness, teaching kids that in reading and helping them translate that to writing. And then over here, we sort of talked about vocabulary, grammatical knowledge. You can see that shared reading model here. And so basically what this is saying is those important foundational skills, do you recognize this as the simple view of reading? Word recognition, a little bit of language comprehension over here. We build on that for both our word reading and spelling process or our discourse level overall language. And really, just really important of how we sort of build these foundations. They're applied for both reading and writing. And then that supports our reading comprehension and written composition. 2 podcasts I'd like to share with you, and you can go back and find these on any platform. If you use Apple, whatever you use for your podcast, you can go back to season 7, episode 8, and listen to Steve Graham talk about the importance of the reading-writing connection. And Steve Graham is really one of the foundational researchers in the world of writing, and he's done and continues to do a lot of work in that. And this is Youngsuk Grace Kim, who we just looked at her model. And in season 9, episode 13 of the podcast, she talks a bit about that model. And she has created a new resource called Cultivating the Reader and Writer, and it's all about this connection between reading and writing. Okay, time to go back to your list. A little bit longer today than what it was yesterday, but I think it's important foundational information to understand the importance of reading and writing. So to start the session, you wrote down words or phrases that you thought we would discuss. I want you to go back to your list, mark the ones that next to the words or phrases we did discuss, and add anything new that you didn't have on your list. And if you're brave, maybe put some of those words or phrases in the chat that you learned throughout the course of this presentation. I love this comment that reading instruction and writing instruction should intertwine and not be separate. They do have a strong correlation. Composition and transcription. See if you can hold those 2 things in your mind. You'll remember that students need to form the letters and spell the words, and they need to get their ideas out on paper. I agree about the less transparency in the English language. It does impact both reading and writing. Yay for syntax, so important. And I'll give you just a little bit more time to make any notes you want to make to sort of cement your learning. This idea of meta-awareness or meta-knowledge is really important as well. Yes, writing improves reading. Reading can improve writing. All right. Oh, I love somebody used the word reciprocity. I love that, between reading and writing, and the idea that they're intertwined. Well, again, start thinking about what questions you might have. We never want to stop learning, because when we stop learning, we stop growing, and we want to feed that language development of our own lifelong learning brains. So Samantha, I think we're ready for some questions and answers. If you're
Wonderful.
ready.
I'm ready. So thank you so much. Another insightful and really rich session. Okay, so let's open the floor for questions. You can use the raise hand feature and then be unmuted to speak, or you can type your question in the chat. And then just remember, Josiah will be providing the sign language interpretation during this segment. So yeah, let's begin. Any hands up? or any questions in the chat? Let's see. Okay. So please do raise your hands and we'll call you to unmute or type your question in the chat.
I think there's one in there, Samantha, about how can shared writing and guided writing support student development
Okay.
by Jennifer. I'd love to talk first about shared writing. I love the idea of shared writing, especially in the early grades. So when we think about kindergarten literacy development, yesterday we talked a lot about the importance of read alouds for students to help them get that rich language experience, that vocabulary in ways that they can't yet read the words on the page, how important that is for students' development. It's the same with shared writing. So the idea that the teacher sits down with a big piece of paper, the students are in front of him or her, and the students are sharing some of their ideas, and the teacher then translates those ideas into sentences or a series of sentences. And that modeling can really help kids understand how to get ideas out and how to write them in complete sentences. And so that's one aspect of shared writing. I think sometimes we think in kindergarten we have to have students sitting down and writing sentences. And if they can, we want them to start trying that. The idea is in the earliest grades, how do we help students get their ideas from their mind down on a piece of paper? Sometimes we ask them to draw, right? To draw what they're understanding or draw an idea. Another way, again, is the shared writing in this whole group environment. Another way you could use shared writing is there's a lot of evidence that writing together with somebody else is highly effective too. And so you can pair students up together to maybe write a summary or write a paragraph. And again, it reduces the cognitive load for students. It helps them interact with peers. They can talk about what they want to write about, and then they can actually produce that writing. So that's another way that you can do this sort of shared writing experience. Guided writing is, I'm not sure what we mean by that. If we mean in the context of guided reading, guided writing, I would say that for writing instruction, this sort of explicit nature of it is we want to, I would never ask a student to sit down with a blank piece of paper and just give them a topic and have them write. I use the example all the time of, the students come back from their summer break and teachers pass out blank pieces of paper. And then they say to the students, I want you to write about something fun you did over the summer or your favorite event that you did over the summer. And sometimes students didn't have a good summer. They didn't do anything fun over the summer, or they don't know what to write about. Better to teach them something or have them read something, get that common base of knowledge and vocabulary, and then ask them to write about it. So we always want to give students information so that they can draw from it rather than from a blank, slate, right? That just doesn't set everybody up for success. And that's when we talk about equity, that's not an equitable exercise. Sometimes I feel like guided reading activities are activities as opposed to writing instruction. And so it's a distinction that I made with Steve Graham in the podcast where we talked about when I was a third grade teacher, I gave my kids a lot of writing activities, but I do not recall doing any writing instruction. I didn't teach them about types of sentences. I didn't help them expand sentences. I didn't help them organize their ideas or think about that. So think about the instruction that needs to surround then that opportunity for students to write. Oh, Samantha, that was a long answer. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, no, no. A good answer. Very clear and precise. So I've seen a question here from, is it Scholastica Masawi? saying, I wonder how the science of writing works with translanguaging practices.
We didn't even talk about translanguaging using that word yesterday, but when we talked about both languages, it's really important. It's really complicated, right? And so I think one of the things that's really important for students in languages that they're secure in versus languages that they're just learning. So let's go back to my third grade example. If I was a third grade teacher and I had a student in my classroom who was very fluent in their home language, they could read in it pretty well, they could write in it pretty well, and I asked them to do some sort of writing piece, I would always allow them the opportunity to write that in their home language. And then we could start that translanguaging practice, meaning we could look at what are some words that are similar in your language and the ways that we could talk about it in the second language, or maybe that language is English. And so whenever we're teaching them how to read, so, we said yesterday, it's really important that if there are sounds in their home language that are similar to the sounds of the new language that they're learning, make that connection with sounds, but also make that connection with the written representation. And so you can use your same kind of connections in reading to help them see that in writing, whether it's with the phonemes or the sounds or the vocabulary words. The other thing too is the importance of, especially for students learning a second language, the importance of that oral language discussion, right? If you want them to write let's say you're teaching them English and you want them to write in English, okay, first have them work out their ideas in the language they're most comfortable with. Then have them talk about those ideas, maybe in the target language, before you even have them represent those ideas on paper. And so just being, I think, respectful of what they can do in their home language before you ask them to put that into then their second language. And I hope, Scholastica, if that was helpful.
Okay, so we have a question. We got a thumbs up there from Scholastica. Great.
Thank you.
So, question from Prince. How can teachers use scaffolding and feedback to improve students' writing outcomes?
Yeah, wow, that's a big question. But let me give you some examples, and it's a really good question. One thing before we talk about scaffolding, we want to make sure too that we're not over scaffolding students. So when you start to scaffold them, remember those scaffolds shouldn't stay in place. We should slowly remove those scaffolds to give the students more and more and more responsibility for their learning. So this is where you can go back to the simple view of writing. So how do you need to scaffold students and provide feedback? Do you need to scaffold them in the area of transcription? So first get clear about what their needs are, or is it in the area of communicating their thoughts? One great scaffolding mechanism when we're talking about them communicating their thoughts are graphic organizers, helping them organize what they're going to write about and how they're going to write about it. Maybe even have them brainstorm a list of vocabulary words that are going to be important to use in that writing. And so then you can provide them, if you know what area, transcription or composition, that you really want to scaffold, that's when you can provide them really specific feedback. In the idea of, like, let's just say listing the vocabulary words I'm going to use in this piece, you can say to them, how are you going to use this vocabulary word? Give me an example of a sentence you would use it in. If they have vocabulary words on there that you're not sure, you can say, I'm not sure that vocabulary word is appropriate for this. Can you help me understand why you used it? And you can use that feedback process there. If you're providing scaffolding and feedback on the transcription side, right, make it very targeted to whether they're not forming their letters correctly, right? So I think using these frameworks of both the simple view of reading and the simple view of writing help you understand what area Do they need scaffolding? And then you can provide feedback on that very specific need that that student has. And that will impact and improve their writing outcome for sure. Oh, and one more thing, Samantha, I want to say. Don't do it all at once, right? Remember the days that you'd write an essay and it would come back from the teacher with everything all scratched up, right? Misspellings in red, incomplete sentences in red, ideas that didn't relate to the topic in red. I think for students, what you want to do, especially those students that are struggling to write, is you want to focus on one area first. If the area is creating appropriate sentences or complex sentences, don't worry about spelling right now. Let's worry and focus on that one area. If it's forming letters and spelling, then don't worry about how the sentences are put together. Let's focus on that one area. Otherwise, students just get too overwhelmed. No wonder no student wants to write, is because they have to do all the things and improve all the things at once. And that's not a great strategy for learning.
That's a really good point. Okay, so Nana Efwa says, how do we help students who can talk about what they want to write, but dislike the writing process? There is no problem with sentence construction or syntax whatsoever, but they appear to just dislike the very act of writing. Most of the time, the handwriting is untidy as well. Any thoughts?
This is a great, you know what? This is a great connection here, because this makes me think, first, let's talk about reading. Students that struggle with dyslexia, they can talk about topics all day long, but when you ask them to read, they dislike the process of reading. Why? Because they're not good at it, right? So what you do for those students with dyslexia, you talk to them, but you also explicitly teach them and help them practice the code. Many times it's the same thing here, is that students have lots of ideas about what they want to write about, but it might be they dislike the writing process because they're not fluent at letter formation and spelling. It takes them too long, right? A couple things that you can do with that. One, you can ask the students to dictate that, and you can have somebody else write that down for them. And that's a fine process, especially for students that struggle with, sort of writing and spelling, forming the letters and spelling. It's sort of like reading out loud to a student so they get the idea of the text or the comprehension. Helping students talk about their ideas and you transcribing for them is a really good strategy. The other strategy is this may be a time that you want students to actually get on the computer and do some typing, right? It might be that they can get their ideas out better when they're actually typing it. And so this would be a time when you would put them on the computer and have them do that. And then the other thing they could do is you could actually, again, scaffold with more detailed graphic organizers, right? So if they have their ideas out, have them just focus on one sentence at a time. And sometimes that can help.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Jennifer wants to know what access arrangements can be put in place to support the fair and appropriate assessment of learners with dyslexia, autism, and diverse learning disabilities.
Okay, so this has to do with assessment, and this feels like it is a really, really big topic about reading and potentially writing. This is a really big topic, but I'm gonna give two answers here. First of all, to support the fair and appropriate assessment of learners, the foundations to that is having a quality assessment. And so that's where we would say for reading, you use something that measures a student's abilities in the areas that we know have a high impact. And you do that in a very standardized way. We were talking yesterday about an assessment called DIBELS, which there is a protocol for administration of that assessment. That's what helps make that fair. because what you want to understand is what students know and can do and what they don't know, so that you can provide then appropriate instruction and intervention. And the skills of reading, so students demonstrating the skills of reading, is the same with all learners, but the way that you instruct and practice with them might be different. Writing is a little more difficult. I think there's no such thing as a standard assessment of writing. But we used yesterday this idea of dictation, having students write words or write sentences that you say. And doing that can give you an insight into what they know about the language that you're teaching them, and where then you need to focus your instruction to support students, in any student, but specifically students with dyslexia, autism, and other learning disabilities. So I think in the writing, in the reading world, right, we talked a little bit about that. In the writing world, when you employ those dictation strategies, you know something about their reading abilities and also about their letter formation, spelling abilities. And so I think that is a really good place to start.
Thank you. Question from Martin. What happens to a child? Sorry, what happens if a child has a problem with fine motor skills?
Then you need to teach them. And you need to give them practice and additional time doing this. I was talking with somebody yesterday where developing a handwriting program, and we were talking about the importance of pencil grip, which you never hear about anymore, right? You don't hear about the importance of how to grip the pencil and how to appropriately write. Some kids pick it up and it's just really natural and you don't have to teach that. Some kids you actually have to teach that idea of pencil grip. The other thing is that before we teach kids how to form letters, we want to make sure they understand how to form horizontal lines, vertical lines, drawing circles, drawing curves, all those prerequisite writing skills. If you skip over that, that can be complicated, and especially children that struggle with fine motor skills, you may have to do some of that prerequisite writing skills before they actually get to this idea of letter formation.
Okay, so following on from that, Wisdom is asking about, apart from handwriting, letter formation, and spelling, can keyboarding also be considered a transcription skill, particularly given the increasing integration of technology into everyday life, education, and professional communication?
The answer to that is yes, keyboarding is a transcription skill. When we're thinking about the relationship between reading and writing, though we looked at some of this research, right? The research in the early grades says that when you take pencil to paper, you form a very tight or much tighter connection than if you use keyboarding to accomplish that goal. And there's also some cognitive science now that is showing that, like, and this comes from university learning. So students sitting in a college classroom, now everybody will pick up their phone, right? Take pictures of the screen, take pictures of the screen, take pictures of the screen, or sit with their computer and type in everything the professor is saying. There's some evidence now that actually handwritten notes are better for your learning process than taking screenshots or typing word for word. That said, that's the learning process. But there is this idea of keyboarding, right? Because like we can't get away from technology. We have to learn how to do that. And I would consider it more of a skill right now than I would consider it a learning mechanism. The only, I think, place we want to remember is that if students need an accommodation for a keyboard or a computer, we want to honor that accommodation because there may be a reason why they can't employ handwriting, paper to pencil, things like that. But keyboarding is important, but remember, for learning and for cognition, this idea of the old-fashioned pencil to paper it has a higher impact.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next question from Blessed Miracle. Please, what specific warning signs in a student's written work should prompt a teacher to start tracking their progress more closely?
That's a great question. So a couple of things. Again, let's think about those two different cognitive capacities we're trying to develop, this idea of transcription and this idea of composition. So when we're thinking about transcription skills, that's letter formation and spelling. Warning signs. The students are taking a long time to be able to write legibly. That's a warning sign. It's just like reading. They're not going to figure it out. You may have to do much more explicit instruction and practice getting them to be able to form the letters. Take the time to do that. It's really important. The sooner we do that, the better. The second warning sign, if students cannot spell, that's a warning sign that there is something not right with their reading, with their sound spelling pattern association. And so you need to see their writing as an insight into what you need to go back to teaching them in the phonics, in the world of phonics. So that's the transcription side. In the composition side, I would say, warning signs. If students aren't able to stay on topic or use vocabulary words that make sense in what they're trying to write, that's a warning sign. You need to give kids more background knowledge information and help them understand the vocabulary words. If kids are unable to make complex sentences or compound sentences, if they're always just writing a simple sentence, a simple sentence, a simple sentence, that's a warning sign that you need to explicitly teach them about how to expand sentences or how to combine sentences together, another high impact strategy. And then if students are not able to get their ideas, they have it in their head, but they can't figure out how to get it down on paper, another warning sign that you need to help them, again, through graphic organizers or something, communicate the ideas and specifically walk through and show them how you can take those ideas and put them into a writing, like a shared writing. And shared writing could be with a teacher and a student, right? Together you're writing sort of shorter pieces. So those are a few warning signs. I love that question because it takes us back to the simple view of writing. And you can think through each of the, where is the student having the deficit? Is the deficit in transcribing or is the deficit in composing, and can help you sort of figure out what you need to do next?
Thank you. I hope that answers your question, Blessed. Now, the next question is from Angela. When students are always writing subordinate clauses as full sentences, even after teaching them sentence types, what interventions can you use to help them?
Some of that is just make sure you do the reading writing connection too. So use model sentences and areas from the text that you're actually doing and reading. This is why we want to teach things integrated. I think one of the best examples of that is go into a book you're reading or a text that you're reading and pull out examples of sentences that are using subordinate clauses, full sentences that are using subordinate clauses, and have students see the difference between that full sentence and what happens if you take the words away and look at the subordinate clauses. So anytime kids are struggling in the construction of something, the construction of complete sentences using subordinate clauses or whatever else they might be struggling with, always take them back to a model text and pull out examples and deconstruct or close read those examples so that students can see what they look like by authors, so they can then start to apply that. And sometimes it's just practicing that over and over and over again. But for interventions like that, always leverage text to use as models and examples.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so Moses wants to know or says, some students with autism spectrum disorders have delayed language development, both in receptive and expressive, and may be nonverbal. Which techniques can be appropriate to develop transcription skills? And he says, thank you, Dr. Lambert, for the presentations.
Oh, you're welcome. This has been such an honor. I've learned so much. So autism spectrum disorders are really like, they're so specific to the student, right? So there's no sort of broad brush general thing that I can say. What I can say is, even though they're nonverbal and can't express, you can still teach them. Let's think about this in the word recognition. You can still teach them to hear the sound and then represent it in writing. If they're able to actually write letters, you can help them to do that over and over and over again, and you can do that reciprocally, right? You can hear the sound, at. Can you write the letters? You can write the letters, M-A-T, and go backwards with that. So again, with any student that needs intervention, leveraging the reciprocity of reading and writing can often benefit, even if they're nonverbal. Maybe they can represent it in writing, or that's when sometimes you have to employ assistive technologies using, the computer, which is outside of my expertise. But sometimes starting with the simple strategies first before you employ those other ones can be effective. And again, Samantha, like that might be another really great topic, is reading and writing for students on autism spectrum disorders.
Definitely, we are noting that down.
I think we talked about that yesterday too.
Yes. Okay. So Abigail wants to know, does excessive screen time usage affect reading and writing?
Well, I think excessive screen time affects attention and cognition and sometimes motivation. And that in turn can then affect reading and writing. You can even think about your own self, right? We've become so addicted to and accustomed to grabbing our phones and getting distracted or getting lost in screen time. I'm not sure that there's research that makes a direct connection for screen time and reading and writing, but I do know there is attention, right? So there's a connection with attention, which we haven't talked at all about executive functioning skills, which impact all of our learning. The other thing I want to say about that screen time is we do know that there is some evidence that when you read a text on a digital device versus reading a text in the good old-fashioned printed way, your comprehension is not as deep, right? You don't get the depth of comprehension reading on a digital device than you do in a good old-fashioned piece of paper. And there's some speculation on that, or some theory on that part of it is when you have a physical piece of paper or a book, that you not only are reading the words on the page, but you're getting an orientation. So one of the big things for kids in the early grades is print concepts. How, for us in English, we go from left to right, we read from top to bottom. There's a page that you turn and then you read again. This sort of physical orientation will help you. And if you think about this, I'm sure you've done this, you've experienced this. You're reading a book and you're noticing your comprehension has broken down. Maybe it's like, wait a minute, I forgot what happened at the beginning of that last page. And you can sort of visualize where it is on the page and you can get back and reorient yourself to where it is in the text. When you're on a digital device, all your orientation is gone because all you're doing is scrolling. So we do know that there is some evidence that if you want a deeper level of comprehension, read in the old-fashioned way, as opposed to reading on the screen. So that's just one example of how this literacy research is continuing to evolve, and that's pretty new research, actually.
Give me the old-fashioned way of reading,
Me
please.
too, Samantha, me too.
Okay, Joy says, what strategies do you put in place to help a child with dyslexia and dysgraphia who is currently in year 8, but writing and spelling is equivalent to a learner in year 2? The learner will opt to answer multiple choice questions rather than written. Typing lessons was recommended. However, it seems impossible as she
Yeah.
keeps forgetting the position of the letters on the keyboard.
Yes, because you're asking her to learn yet something else new, right? And for students with dyslexia and dysgraphia, that is not helpful. So again, I would say the strategy I would put in place here is dependent on the student. So let's think about the dyslexia element and the dysgraphia element. So again, it's really hard to answer these with broad brush answers because when we're talking about this, it's very individualized to the student because not only is it the dyslexia and dysgraphia we're trying to overcome, we're also trying to overcome perhaps areas of executive functioning or even confidence level, right? I'm sure confidence level and motivation is really low. So we have to start with some of these small wins to build confidence and keep building. And I would say I would go to all the way back to the writing and spelling piece of it was the student taught reciprocally? Like, could we go back to, and I wouldn't say simple words like CVC words for a student who is in year 8, but I would say multisyllabic words. Can we start to break those down at the word level into individual sections of the word, whether that's syllables or whether that's morphemes or word parts? Sort of teach those sound spelling patterns at the same time we're writing them. And if that will help sort of build the confidence. I think opting to answer multiple choice questions rather than writing them, ask yourself, what are we trying to get at when we're asking these multiple choice questions? Are we asking the student to tell us what they comprehend about the text? Do we have to have them do that in a written form, or could we have them speak that and tell us about it? So I always think assessment is so tricky because you have to think about what you're trying to assess. Are you trying to assess that they can write a sentence or write into a response? Find another way to do that and then scaffold them into actually doing that writing. And I totally agree with these typing lessons is I feel like if we can try to get at the fluency in writing, that this student is going to feel a lot more confident and then maybe tackle this idea of the position of the letters of the keyboard, which on our keyboards are all messed up, right? So when you already are not seeing words or writing words appropriately, thinking about the letters on a keyboard can be really, really confusing. So that's where your models will help you, the simple view of reading and the simple view of writing. So dyslexia and dysgraphia or that word recognition and transcription, really focus on instruction there while relieving them of sort of comprehension and composition by putting a lot of support. Listen on audiobooks to get the language of that. Have somebody read aloud to them. Have somebody sit and transcribe their thinking so that they can get that out. So focus on the area that needs support and then relieve them for the other areas so that you can work on one thing at a time. Samantha, did that make sense?
It did, very much so. I hope that answered your question, Joy. So Queen wants to know again, how about a child with signs of dysgraphia? How do we help that child? How about a child who has mastered the grip but writes very slowly? What explains a child's inability to not write as fast and always finishes last or does not finish at all?
Yeah. So first of all, if the writing is very slowly and we're talking about doing it for some kind of assessment, please help the student get somebody to transcribe those words or provide some kind of support or accommodation for that student. Because I think at the end of the day, many times what we are most interested in is what they know and not so much how quickly they can write that. So honor the students' thinking and knowledge by finding a way around that in terms of an assignment or an assessment. So when students have signs of dysgraphia, it's sort of like dyslexia, right? There's a whole range of them. First of all, you want to think about prevention. And so if they haven't had the prerequisite writing skills, like make sure the horizontal, vertical lines, the ability to draw curves and circles, right? That sometimes just practicing that will be helpful. Sometimes students need more practice or explicit instruction one-to-one with letter formation, right? So that is like saying, when we write the letter H, we do a vertical line top to bottom. And then we're going to make a curve and go all the way down. So teaching them explicit strokes and having them practice those explicit strokes over and over and over again are a way to prevent in some ways, but they also then needs lots and lots of practice doing that letter formation. And you can do it rather than having them do it with pencil and paper first. You can have them do that with air writing, right? Like you can have them do that in sand so they can practice and see and feel the flow or the rhythm of writing the letters. And so we just want to make sure they've got the grip. That's awesome. Sometimes that's the worst part. But when they write really, really slowly, they just need extra practice with that, or they're just going to need accommodation, either extra time to complete things or somebody to help transcribe that, or we might have to put them on a keyboard or a computer to help complete that. And
All right.
I don't know what explains the inability to not write fast, right? I don't know.
That's great. I hope we've answered your question. That was from Queen, I think.
Yeah.
And then I think this will probably be our last question. So Blessed wants to know, by grade 3 or older or struggling readers are often painfully aware they've fallen behind their peers. Please, how do we rebuild confidence in them in those who have already given up? So
This is
as a counselor, this is a good question for you to
Th-
answer.
oh my gosh, this is such a great question because I've seen it happen, even with my own child, right? Like with Michael, who has dyslexia, and he was diagnosed in 4th grade. And I will never forget that 4th grade year where he sat on the steps at home and cried every day that his stomach hurt and he couldn't go to school because he was painfully aware that he was behind his peers. This is where sometimes it's really important, first of all, to not make a kid perform in front of their peers. And what I mean by that is if you know that this student is aware, very unconfident, very embarrassed by their inability to read, don't ask them to read out loud in a whole class or with peers. You want to make sure that you can get really small wins to build up their confidence. And this is where one-on-one, that really intensive intervention is going to be really helpful. You know, sometimes we we forget about the confidence or the embarrassment or how hard it is for students. You know, maybe they're made fun of because they can't read, and we don't want them to be in that culture or that environment at school, right? School should be there to support, provide intervention, give them confidence to get back on track. And so make sure you understand where you need to start with that student in instruction. That's where a really strong diagnostic assessment would help. Give them that one-on-one intervention or tutoring to help build their confidence. And sometimes it's in really small ways. Sometimes it's, let's read this word list. Look at you. You read that word list Then it's maybe a sentence in a decodable reader. Look at you, you did it. You can do this, right? So you need to be compassionate and supportive alongside really explicit instruction. So I think one mistake we often make is we care so much about students and we don't want to see them feel bad or be unconfident. And we try to give them support and compassion and encouragement without giving them the instruction they need. They need both things. They need the instruction to help catch them up with their peers, and they need to have that done in a compassionate, supportive environment where they can see themselves growing and learning to gain that confidence. And that's such a great question.
Okay, thank you so much. Just wanted, I think that's a great way to end the questions. And just a comment from, sorry, let me get a comment from Comfort, who says that these are great questions. As soon as she starts typing, she sees that someone has asked it already and she's having a great time. So I think that's a wonderful way
Yay!
to conclude. Okay. All right. Sorry, there's one last question. I think we have a minute. I hope it's not going to take too long before we do the closing remarks and announcements. So, Rose, let me ask your question. Um, it says, sorry if this has been answered or asked already, but how do you encourage a child who has this dysgraphia and has moved from air writing and board writing and has now started writing in a book, but needs to be prompted a lot of the time? How do you encourage this child to write more, please? I think maybe,
That's a good question. And I like that we've already started with air writing, board writing, so we've sort of gone through some of the stages to support the practice. First of all, help the child become confident in small ways. So the worst thing that you can do, and the thing that you could do to make a child not write more, not like writing and really like start to hate writing, is to ask them to do more of something they're not good at. And so doing smaller practice sessions more often to help build their confidence and build their ability is better than asking them to practice longer times at something that they're not good at. And so as you start to build their confidence and competence with that writing process, then you can start making those sessions longer and longer and longer. So yes, applaud them for writing in small ways, show them how well they're doing, give them positive feedback and also corrective feedback if they need it, and then start to build their ability to stay with that longer and longer and longer and longer. But doing something you don't like to do and you're not really good at for a longer amount of time is so painful as an adult. Just imagine what it would be like for a child. So thank you for that question.
very much so. Dr. Lambert, thank you so much for the two outstanding sessions across these 2 days. I really believe that your ability to translate decades of complex research into clear, practical, and inspiring knowledge is a true gift to every educator in this room this evening, and we are deeply grateful. Thank you so much to Martin and to Josiah for ensuring that this space remained fully accessible throughout both days. And to each of you, whether you joined us for one day or for both, thank you for your time. Thank you for your engagement and your commitment to the learners that are in your care. Now, we hope that these 2 sessions have given you new insight and tools that you can take back into your classrooms immediately. So I want to end with some announcements. So if you just give me a couple minutes to go through these important announcements. So before we close, I'm delighted to share what is coming next on the ADO Online Academy. So on Friday, the 28th of August, 2026, we will be hosting a very special session, Breaking Down Barriers to Reading with Barrington Stoke. Now, our facilitator will be Jane Walker, Sales and Marketing Director at Barrington Stoke. and a publisher with 25 years mission, with a 25-year mission to help every child read. Now, for some children, reading is a challenge, whether they are reluctant to read for pleasure or struggle due to dyslexia or visual stress. Now, this session will navigate through techniques to encourage, motivate, and enable both struggling and reluctant learners to love reading through the power of a good story and accessible books. Now, Jane will also introduce high-low books, high interest, low reading level, and reading age identifiers, giving educators and parents practical tools to guide every learner's reading journey. Now, this session is free and it runs from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. and is designed for educators, librarians, booksellers, and parents. Registration details will be shared very soon on all of our social media platforms and through WhatsApp and Telegram communities. So please watch this space and share with your colleagues. And then our second announcement, we also have a very exciting two-part professional development training coming in September that I want to make sure that you know about. Now, ADO Online Academy will be hosting Supporting Learners with Maths Difficulties, Practical Classroom Strategies for Dyscalculia, and interactive hands-on training led by two internationally recognized dyscalculia specialists. So that's Kate Edel and Rob Jennings, who are co-founders of the Dyscalculia Network in the United Kingdom. Now, this training runs across two separate sessions, each designed for a different level. Now, session 1 is for secondary teachers and takes place on Friday, the 25th of September, 2026. And this session focuses on intervention strategies for higher level mathematical concepts, fractions, decimals, percentages, and algebra. Participants will learn to identify the prerequisite skills learners need and then explore multisensory teaching through the CPVVA approach and discover practical games and activities that make abstract maths accessible. Then for session 2, this is for primary teachers and takes place on Wednesday, the 30th of September, 2026. Now, this session focuses on evidence-based intervention strategies for the 4 core mathematical operations: addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. Participants will explore inclusive teaching practices, multisensory approaches using everyday manipulatives, and engaging classroom activities that build mathematical confidence. Now, both sessions run from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. live on Zoom. Participants may register for one or for both sessions. Now, this training is designed for classroom teachers, special education teachers, learning support teachers, SEN coordinators, school leaders, teaching assistants, tutors, and parents supporting children with maths difficulties. Each registered participant will receive live interactive training with internationally recognized dyscalculia specialists, practical classroom resources and teaching ideas, evidence-based interventions, and a digital certificate of participation from ADO. Now, please note that this is a paid training. So the early bird rate is 350 Ghana cedis per session if you register before the 20th of August, 2026. So please make sure you get in early if you want to take advantage of the early bird rate. After that date, the regular rate of 450 Ghana cedis will apply. That will be per session. Now, seats are strictly limited, so we strongly encourage you to register early. For inquiries and registrations, please call our WhatsApp lines. The information is also in the chat for you to take note of. So you can contact us on WhatsApp on +233, then 359 149 9970, or +233 241 843 287. Again, the information is also in the chat. There'll be flyers and the registration details will be shared across all platforms. So please make sure you follow ADA on all social media and share with your colleagues. Okay, so again, check the chat for that information. Now, this is your final reminder about your certificate of participation for these 2 days that we've just done. Now, participation in this training that you've completed yesterday and today, for those who've done both days, it's been completely free. Now, participants who wish to receive a certificate of participation for today's session need to make a voluntary contribution. So for a digital certificate, it is 50 Ghana cedis, approximately $5. And for a hard copy certificate, then that would be 100 cedis, approximately $10. Delivery fees will apply for the hard copy certificate. Now, for your payment options, we are using MTN mobile money, and the number, again, it will be placed in the chat, 024 184 3287. And that's the mobile money number for Africa Dyslexia Organization. You can also pay by credit card, and the link will be in the chat or will be when you receive the feedback form. You'll see the payment options. For the credit card, you'll click on the link and it will take you to the payment page. Now, very important, after making your payment, you must WhatsApp the same number, 024 184 3287, and we need 2 things for you to send us in that WhatsApp. First of all, your full name, exactly as you want it to appear on your certificate. So please double check as you're sending your name, that is how you want it to appear on your certificate. And then secondly, your correct email address. So please, those of us who don't clear our email boxes and we're not receiving new emails, please make sure you clear your email box so you're receiving new emails. Please make sure you've entered your email address correctly so you can receive your certificate. Now, please do not send a payment screenshot alone. Without your full name and the correct email address, our accounts team cannot process your certificate. So we want everyone who has requested to be able to receive that certificate of participation without difficulty. So please follow those steps carefully. Check in the chat again for the details. And then finally, we're about to close, but we'd be most grateful if you could just take 5 minutes to complete our post-training feedback form for today's session. Responses are anonymous and they directly help ADO to improve our programs for educators and learners across Africa. So we really appreciate it when you take just a few minutes to complete the feedback form. Let me see, the link should be in the chat now. Yep, so I can see the feedback form link is in the chat. So please go to the chat, click on it, and spend just a couple of minutes to complete the feedback form. Please note that the recordings and any available resources from both sessions will be shared with all registered participants. So yes, you'll get the recordings and the resources once you had registered. And please watch your inbox and follow our social media pages at africadyslexia.org, at africadyslexia.org on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, YouTube, and TikTok for all upcoming ADO Online Academy announcements. Thank you so much to all of you for joining. Thank you once again, Dr. Lambert. Thank you to all our educators, everybody who has joined this evening. Please do keep championing every learner. We appreciate all the efforts you're putting in as educators to enhance your skills and be the best educator for your learners. Thank you very much and good night. As you're logging off, you can take a quick look in the chat, click on the feedback form, check your emails for all the resources. If you have any questions or challenges with payment, please contact the ADO line and you'll be able to get help that you need.